please check out this episode of Max Talks AI, the video that I recorded of my interview with Mark Purdy. Mark Purdy is Managing Director and Chief Economist at Accenture Research, specifically focusing on artificial intelligence and the intersection of AI, macroeconomics, and business. So please enjoy the episode, and I hope you like it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Max Talks AI. Today I have Mark Purdy with me. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Max. How are you?
Very good. Yourself?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the call. It's been quite long awaited for me. We've been trying to synchronize our calendars for a while now after the economic summit, and now we're finally here. I'm super excited. Actually, now that I started talking about it, could you speak about your experience at Warwick and then sort of how we met and then how we decided to do this?
Yes. So Max and I met a couple of months ago at the Warwick Economics Summit, which I believe is the biggest student-run economics summit in the world. I think there were probably about four or 500 people present at the summit. It was being streamed live on Facebook. There was a whole series of different speakers and presentations over the course of 3 days. And I was part of a panel discussion on the future of work, where we talked about a lot of the kind of issues affecting work and jobs, including demographics, technology, and automation. And it was a very interesting discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground. I was also tremendously impressed, by the way, with the whole organisation of the summit and the Warwick Economics Society, and just how the whole event had been run. So it was a great experience for me.
Yeah, it's quite, for those who listen, Warwick is this university in the UK in a beautiful land of Warwickshire and Coventry, and it hosts quite a big event, as Mark was saying, and I'm an alumni myself, so I came down. Yeah, it was really well organized for the student-run event, and props to the guys. Yeah, it was pretty cool, and it attracts very high-profile guests such as Mark, and also your speech was very great, and then the time we got to spend afterwards with some of the other guys was pretty cool. So I'm really bad with accents, but you are Irish, right?
Well, that's correct. I'm originally from Dublin, Ireland. I moved over to the UK about 22 years ago, so I've been living in London
That's exactly my age.
for the past sort of two decades. And I have family here, and this is where I work. Although my role at Accenture is very much a global role. I work on projects with a global scope. I work with people and colleagues from all over the world, and I frequently travel to many parts of the world to give speeches and do panel discussions and so forth.
What was your best event that you had a chance to visit recently, apart from Warwick?
Apart from Warwick, I went to I spoke at a very interesting event in Cartagena in Colombia last August, which had been organized by the Colombian telecoms regulator, and they were beginning to look at the impact of AI on Colombia, the kind of economic and social impact, and also its implications for business. So I had an opportunity to talk about our research on why AI is the future of economic growth. But I also chaired a panel discussion where we had panelists from a number of different organizations. For example, we had someone from Google there. We had someone from Facebook. And so we were able to kind of really explore all of these issues around the future impact of AI, not just the economic impact, but what impact is it having on society? What impact could it potentially have on jobs and the nature of work? What are some of the issues around kind of ethics and privacy, and how do we respond to those? So it was a very sort of
Hmm.
stimulating event in a great city, in a country to which I had never been before.
Yeah, I've never been either, but sounds really cool. Before, as I understand, so that you are now very much interested in macroeconomics, business, and technology, and sort of where those three come together, with focus on jobs and what technology is going to do to jobs and the way we sort of create value, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as an economist, and I've worked in various different places over the years. I actually started out as a microeconomist.
Could you just for a brief second talk about your motivations to study economics? And I know that you went to Trinity College Dublin because that's what your LinkedIn says, and you went on to do masters in economics in at the same university, right? So,
Yeah.
what motivated you to do economics in the first place, and how was your experience of studying it at the university and then working as an economist?
Yes. Why did I decide to study economics? Well, I initially began studying economics in high school,
Hmm.
in secondary school in Dublin. And I think it's fair to say, as whatever, a 16-year-old, I didn't initially have a very good idea of what economics was.
Uh-huh.
I probably had a few that it was something to do with financial markets. But as I began to study it, even at that stage, I got an inkling that it's a very powerful way of understanding, what's going on in the world and how people make decisions, what incentivizes people. And I began to realize that you could pretty much apply economics to any kind of sphere of life, and develop quite a powerful framework for understanding that. So why do we have unemployment?
Hmm.
Why is inflation a problem? Why do some firms succeed and others go out of business? Why are some people poor and some people rich? And what should we do with that about that?
Hmm.
I also began to sort of understand, as I progressed to university and studied it in more depth, um, that the potentially there are a lot of problems with markets. The market can be very very effective at solving a lot of societal problems, but there are a lot of things they can't solve. There are a lot of market imperfections, and so often you need governments to intervene, or you need alternative solutions. So that kind of helped me to get a good grasp of public policy,
Hmm.
and understand how governments and policies could actually improve outcomes for individuals. So, I think that a lot of people who haven't studied economics often don't really know what it's about. They probably have a view that it's very much around finance and the stock exchange and so on. And it really isn't. It's really about what motivates and drives human behavior. Um, and ultimately, it's about improving the welfare of individuals. Understanding
Hmm.
how do we make people better off? How do we improve living standards? And what are some of the good ways to do that, and some of the wrong ways to do that?
Yes.
So that's why I've typically I've found it to be a very useful kind of prism to kind of apply to kind of any problem of everyday life. It's not, of course, it's not the only framework. There are many others. There's obviously political science perspectives and sociological perspectives and so on. But economics is one such framework, and I found it to be a very powerful one.
Hmm. And then when does the interest in technology come in? Did you feel like it was kind of inevitable that because it was having such a great impact on economy and growth, or you just became techy and tech savvy and then that tripled over into your interest in economics? How did that intersection came about?
Well, the interest in technology has come relatively late in my career. Um, I mean, I've worked on quite a lot of different economic research topics over the years in in different organizations, and even in Accenture I've worked on a lot of different topics. But one of the areas that I was very interested in was competitiveness, and what drives economic growth in economies. And there's quite a lot of economic literature out there, and a lot of kind of models around what
Hmm.
drives growth in economies. Um, but I began to think about, well, what could be the impact of technology, and there seemed to be a debate kind of out there around, well, technology potentially is a very powerful driver of economic growth, but yet at the same time, economic growth for the last few years in many parts of the world has been quite weak, and we have pretty poor productivity growth compared with a few years ago. So
Hmm.
I began to think a lot more about how technology interacts with the economy, and why is it that technology in some cases seems to drive accelerated growth, and in other cases it seems to have less of an impact. So that initially got me into thinking along a number of areas. One is, are economies which are more digitized, do they tend to have higher economic growth? That
Hmm.
was the first project that I worked on, and we found, yes, in general, economies which are more digital do tend to have faster economic growth rates. Um, then secondly, I began to look at the Internet of Things, which again, for your listeners who are not familiar, the Internet of Things is really about a world of very smart, connected objects. So if you think about, your fridge being able to talk to your mobile phone,
Hmm.
and tell you when you're out of milk, and kind of actually making the order for milk from the supermarkets.
I love how technology is so powerful. Usually, sort of to give an example of one, you would pick milk or beer, sort of the necessities of our society, to give an example of what Internet of Things is going to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, every potentially sort of every object can be made smart. Your
Yeah.
car, the windows in your home, can be made sensitive to the weather. Your kind of toothbrush, kind of the watch on your hands. Um, and you get to a stage where potentially those objects can talk to each other, but also all of the data that those smart objects generate can be collated and then analyzed and sort of fed back to the objects, so they actually work
Hmm.
more efficiently in the future. So, thinking about say factories which use a type of machinery or a common component, you can aggregate all of that data from the different components in the different machines in different factories, and the manufacturers can then analyze that. They can identify faults or defects in real time before they happen, and they can
Hmm.
do predictive maintenance. So you don't have a whole kind of 24 hours of downtime while you try and fix a problem.
Hmm.
So that was the initial area that I began to look at, the Internet of Things. And I produced a report a few years ago looking at the economic impact of the Internet of Things. So it's sometimes called the industrial internet as well.
Yes.
And again, we found that it could potentially be a very powerful driver of economic growth. But the qualification was that it depended a lot on the kind of the economic and industrial kind of setup of the particular country. Some
That's
countries,
the absorptive
yeah.
capacity, right, that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean it partly depends on the industrial structure of
Uh-huh.
a country. So, obviously if you're talking about Germany, which has a big manufacturing sector, advanced manufacturing sector, and then you bring in the idea of all these kind of smart objects that you can attach to machines, and have kind of sensors on the different machines and analyze all of that data, then the productivity premium is potentially huge,
Hmm.
because you're taking an already advanced sector and making it even more productive.
Hmm.
But it also depends to some extent on what we called the national absorptive capacity. This was a kind of a measure of how well different economies can actually take and diffuse a new technology throughout their economy. Um,
Hmm.
and again, we'd done some research um, where we looked at previous what are called general purpose technologies in the past. So, for example, electricity or the motor car, the internal combustion engine,
Hmm.
or the internet. And what we typically found was that it wasn't necessarily the introduction of the new technology that made the biggest difference. It was actually how quickly different countries were able to adopt their organizations and
Hmm.
institutions and consumers around the new technology. So to give you a classic example, when electricity began to be introduced, I guess, at the end of the 19th century, most developed economies had access to that technology. The UK and the US had access. The US actually went further ahead much more quickly. And one of the reasons was that the US was still in the process of building out a lot of factories. It
Hmm.
was still expanding, so it was able to design um, new factories with electricity in mind.
Hmm.
And so you get things like the assembly line, where the product actually moves around the different kind of
Hmm.
workstations, rather than the kind of static workstations that you had in the past. So the extent to which firms and consumers and the kind of the institutions of the society are adaptable to the new technology and are able to diffuse it across the wider economy tends to be the key the determinant of how fast the new technology will have an economic impact. So we developed this index we call the national absorptive capacity, and we kind of measured that for about, I guess, 35 different economies across the
Hmm.
world. Um, and that has actually proved to be quite an important part of a lot of the kind of the modeling that we do around technology in terms of understanding its wider economic impact.
So that if you then take this example of how well a country is prepared with its institutional and other kinds of environment to kind of harness the power of technologies, would you say that in AI's case there are two different ways where big players are doing it on a national level? US is kind of leading the way in terms of leaving it to the private companies, whereas China is having very much centralized top-down policy in terms of we're going to dominate AI and we're going to beat everyone in this domain. Do you think that those two countries are now kind of paving the way for everyone else? And what do you think about those two different approaches to it?
Well, I think there's room for both models.
Hmm.
Both models have their pros and cons. I would say. Uh, I mean, the advantage of the kind of the US system, which one might typify as a kind of a free market system, although of course there's a huge element of kind of government,
Yeah.
involvement in kind of research and uh, the kind of technology sector and kind of the industrial sector. It works for the US because that is an area where you have a huge amount of technology expertise. You have a lot of the most kind of dynamic companies in the world. You have a lot of the talent.
Of course.
You have venture capital. You have a really good sort of mix of ingredients, and that has worked for the US. And the US typically comes out in the top kind of five of countries around the world um, in terms of their positioning. around technology diffusion. When you look at China and maybe developed economies, well, often they have to pursue a different approach because, they don't have the same um, institutional setup. They may not necessarily have ready-made access to skills. They may not have the clusters of venture capital. So you often see governments becoming more directly involved and kind of, to a certain extent, kind of directing,
Hmm.
the areas for investment. Also, in many cases, particularly for developing economies, they also have big kind of social kind of needs as well. So
Hmm.
often governments are trying to kind of ally technological progress with sort of economic progress and kind of social progress, meeting social needs, whether it's kind of healthcare or the environment as well. So I think different models work in different situations. I think the problem is sometimes um, governments maybe rely too much on say a free market model without kind of recognizing that sometimes the free market model may not deliver as much kind of early investment as might be needed.
Hmm. Hmm. So that on the developing countries point, because in your new paper, Future of Growth, I mean relatively new, uh, I believe the sample size or the countries you're looking into is developed economies, right?
Well, yes, that's true. So the initial paper, we looked at 12 developed economies
Hmm.
across the world. But we have since extended the analysis to an additional 18 countries.
Uh-huh. Then did you see the difference in terms of the impact? Because I think you've done a really great job in terms of splitting the effects that AI does, and I think it's one of the best features of the paper of splitting it into intelligent automation, capital and labor augmentation, and innovation diffusion, because that kind of sets the tone of what different domains where AI is impactful. Uh, which domain would you say had the most difference in terms of going from a developed country to developing? Which part of that AI equation was affected the most?
Yeah, well, it really did depend a lot
Hmm.
on the country, and as you say, one of the advantages of the modeling that we did, or one of the unique features of the modeling that we did, looking at the economic impact of AI, is that we were able to break it down into the different kind of channels or ways in which AI could affect growth. So, there was the kind of the automation effect, which is essentially where AI substitutes for labor. But there was
Hmm.
also a big augmentation effect. So where AI, robotics or machine learning is used to complement labor and make it more productive. And there was also an innovation effect where you get kind of spillovers, innovation spillovers from AI across the wider economy. I guess I would say if there was any sort of pattern between developed and developing, I think
Hmm.
for a lot of the developing economies, that the probably the substitution effect, the kind of the automation effect,
Hmm.
was sometimes potentially a bit higher, and that partly reflected occasionally the industrial structure, the occupational structure of those economies, in that you tended to have a higher proportion of those occupations that were more susceptible to automation.
Hmm.
Um, but it varies quite a lot because the other sort of issue that developing economies face is often around productivity. So we did see the augmentation effect as well, but potentially, as I say, in some cases, the automation effect was bigger for developing economies, and that was simply because of their particular industrial structure, the fact that they might have more, say, basic manufacturing, they might have more labor in those occupations that are easier to automate.
Hmm. Hmm. Then would you say that for some of those developing countries, kind of focusing quite heavily on AI and this kind of exponential growth is the way to, very quickly catch up with the developed countries? Because there's quite a bit of potential there of kind of leapfrogging the technology, sort of what Africa did with the cable internet, of jumping straight on sort of the newest thing and skipping some of the stuff that they never quite adopted on time.
Yes, I think there are huge leapfrogging opportunities. I think that different economies, they have to think about AI in terms of their industrial structure,
Hmm.
um, and they have to do it in a way that is sort of consistent with their labor force. So, for example, if you're a developing economy and let's say you have a lot of unemployment and you have a very young labor force, for example, in the Middle East, and actually we're looking at the Middle East at the moment, then you want to use AI in a way that is actually going to be much more around augmenting the skills of the workforce.
Hmm.
And increasing productivity. You don't necessarily, you may want a bit of intelligent automation, but you also want a huge amount of the augmentation and the innovation effect. So thinking about the different types of AI, thinking about how it sort of fits with your industrial structure and where you want to go in the future, and also thinking about your kind of social needs. You know, if you know if you've got a very young workforce, if you know you're going to have to provide a lot of jobs, then you want the kind of AI that's going to really have the biggest impact in terms of job creation.
Hmm. Okay, the Middle East is actually quite active in this whole AI field with the Sophia, the first citizenship that Saudi Arabia gave, and in Dubai there is a bunch of forums on AI. So very interesting. I know that we are under time constraints, so before you shoot off, if I could ask you one practical advice.
Mm.
So if we just could take a very small social layer of quite educated university graduates, right? Whatever a person might have done, whether it's economics or engineering or any one of the degrees, and now they're looking at the potential career path that is in front of them, and there is this whole AI disruption fear mongering going on in the media of how AI is going to take all of our jobs, and then it will just end up being pretty much unemployed for the rest of our lives unless UBI comes along. Uh, what kind of advice should we just be looking at any career path and then critically analyzing what is technology going to do to this path and how can I kind of take an edge over competition in that field not to be disrupted?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would take a step back a bit, and I think it's important to think about the different types of jobs that we're going to have in the future, the different types of work. So, we've been talking about, if you think about a spectrum, so, at one extreme, we'll have a lot of human only jobs as we do today. And typically these would be the kind of jobs that involve a lot of creativity, thinking, applying common sense, kind of empathy, communication, um, the social kind of interaction, working with people, working with older people, for example. These are the kinds of jobs that it's very difficult to
Hmm.
imagine robots or algorithms or machines doing at any stage in the future, precisely because they're non-routine type jobs. They're very context dependent.
Hmm.
At the other extreme, we will have, I think, some areas where there'll be a lot of automation. Um, where we
But
see that,
automation, you mean kind of, sorry, you mean complete sort of replacement, right?
well, if not complete, but a
To a large
significant amount
extent.
of
Uh-huh.
of displacement. Thinking about, for example, a lot of jobs in transport, for example,
Yeah.
with the advent of self-driving cars. Um, but even kind of more analytical jobs, we already see that, for example, MRI scans, can actually be analyzed by algorithms with a very high success rate. Although interestingly, when you have the algorithm and the human, the success rate is even higher.
Yeah.
So but there will be some areas where they'll become, if not machine only, but with a very high proportion of displacement. And then I think we're going to have a fast swathe of jobs in the middle. We call this the missing middle,
Hmm.
where it's really
What
about,
if you had to put a
yeah,
percentage on it? What would you think?
it's really really difficult, and I'd be very hard pressed to put
Okay.
there. But I would say, think about spectrum, and you've got, I think, probably a pretty small proportion of jobs that are fully displaced, fully
Uh-huh.
automated. You'll have a big swathe that will be machines and humans working together in different ways and in different combinations. And then you'll have a pretty sizable chunk of still human only jobs. But the point is that if you're thinking about what kind of career path to follow, what kind of skills you need in the future, you need to be kind of thinking very much around A, the kind of human only skills, and then B, how you would work with machines. So think about what makes you uniquely human. In any job, what is it that you can bring that a machine can't do? Is that
Hmm.
kind of creativity, the ability to improvise, the ability to come up with out of the box solutions, the ability to take the latest technology to take algorithms and actually work with them. So that's what I think
Hmm.
younger people, particularly people who maybe are in college and thinking about the future, it's not just about knowledge. It's not just about doing routine kind of work. It's about that ability to adapt and be creative. I think everyone will have to change
Hmm.
over time. There's, I know it's a sort of a cliche, but there is no such thing really as one occupation for life, because it's always going to change. But if you think about what you can uniquely bring, uh, and that is unlikely to be displaced by a machine, but
Hmm.
perhaps enhanced by a machine, then you'll be in a good position, and always be prepared to keep learning. Because the fallacy that we have a little bit, people still have, is that you go to school, you go to
Yeah.
university,
Yeah.
you study it, you're then an engineer or a computer scientist or whatever. You've done it, and then you're working. So it just doesn't work like that anymore. People need to continually keep their skills fresh, continually learn, and just be adaptable. Just be willing to learn new skills and adapt as you go along. I mean, I would say that adaptability and creativity are really the most prized skills in the workforce now, because
Uh-huh.
they're hugely important to organizations, and they're incredibly hard to replicate.
And then would you say then it's because I feel that either school or universities are not really teaching, there is no subject called empathy where they would teach you empathy or creativity as a standalone subjects. Then would you think that it's more on the side of the companies that employ you to kind of train you for those skills that they need, or is it just kind of self-learning and you're on your own to somehow become creative and start
Well,
thinking outside of the box?
yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and we don't quite know um,
In
how,
in a
how
in a
to
perfect in a perfect
in
world.
the perfect world. We don't quite know. Yeah, the problem is we don't quite know how to create these skills, or what makes some people more creative or empathetic than others. I mean,
Hmm.
my sort of personal view or instinct is that we may have to do it quite indirectly. That we need to start with things like the school curriculum and think about are we teaching people music? Are we teaching people drama? Are we teaching people art? Because I'm not sure you can teach people to be creative directly or
Hmm.
empathetic directly, um, but you can expose them to the disciplines that actually encourage those sort of traits in later life. So even if they do end up becoming an engineer or computer scientist, they've actually been kind of exposed to creative impulses. They know what it's like to be creative. So I don't have a hard and fast answer, but I suspect that that may be part of it, and so I think that calls for a much more kind of varied curriculum. It's people talk a lot about STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. I mean, I think definitely STEM is going to continue to be important, but it's not
Hmm.
all just about STEM. It's also about the kind of social skills as well, and it's about the arts. And it's not just about having more arts graduates, but it's actually having people who've been exposed to different influences and who are bringing creativity to their role, regardless of whether they're a computer scientist or an
Hmm.
engineer. Any role, any job, you can have creativity. I mean, the idea sometimes is that we think, there are certain roles that are more creative than others. We talk about the kind of the artistic or the creative occupations, but you can be creative as an economist or as a political scientist or an engineer, but we need to understand how to inculcate those skills in people. And personally, I think it really does start in the schools, in the educational curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we start talking about education, it's going to be another podcast, and
Yeah,
I'm aware
absolutely.
another episode. I'm aware that you have to shoot off. Thank you very much for taking the time, and best of luck to you. I will link all the papers for everyone to check them out. Is there anything that is coming out soon from the Accenture research that you would like to announce, or anything where people should find you, on your personal pages, or just anything you want to bring awareness about?
Sure, of course. Well, I would just mention a couple of things. One is that we have a new report out that we're calling a Business Futures,
Hmm.
um,
Very beautiful, that
which
one. Very, very nicely done in terms of design.
yeah, absolutely, and that's on the website. But it looks at kind of four kind of future worlds, including one based on virtual reality, which we're calling the imagination economy. So that's well worth looking at. If you can get it on a website, or you can drop me an email. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. So please do follow me, because I often send out sort of updates, via social media.
Cool. All right, great. Thank you very much, and good luck for the day.
Thank you very much, Max, and good to talk to you.
Thank you. Ciao, Mark.